This is Kristin Shaw with Airport Improvement Magazine, and I have Chrissy, Mancini, Nichols, and Sue Thompson from Walker Consultants today. Ladies, how are you?
Doing good, thank you.
Yeah, doing great. Thanks, Kristin.
Good. What could airports be doing to improve some of their operations or to catch up on some things maybe they wanted to catch up on as it relates to your business right now?
Well, you know, right now with the reduction in passengers, I mean, this is the perfect time for airports to take advantage of the things that they don't normally have time to do, or the bandwidth to do. And also, it's really difficult to do a lot of the things related to, to parking and transportation and curb management at airports when you have so many passengers. So, some of the things that we are recommending to our clients, or just to any airport, is look at your equipment and your maintenance. What do you need to do? Can you perform full maintenance on things that you just never have the time to do? Can you look at your parking structures? Is there any repairs or things that you want to look at? And also, contactless parking has become quite a big thing since COVID-19. So what can you do to make it contactless, or as much as possible, for when people do start coming back? Having worked in an airport before, I know I never had time to clean, never. So, get out there, clean your garages, clean your stairwells, paint your garages. Do things like change out your lighting. Is now the time for you to change out and go to LED, which will be more efficient and makes it brighter, makes it look cleaner. And another thing is look at your signage. So many times we have signage in our parking facilities, or ground transportation, or on your curbs, where you don't, take a really good look at it. Is there enough signage? Is there too much signage? Follow the paths that your pedestrians, your customers walk. Do you have the right signage out there? Is it leading them to where you need them to go? Or if you have a parking guidance system, is the signage in the right place for that? Or even more important, is it working? Because if it's not working and your customers see one time it doesn't work, they're not going to come back or they're not going to trust that when they come back again. Another thing is, look at your parking lot itself. Look at the functional design. Is it efficient? Is it efficient for your customers? Is it efficient for your shuttle buses? Are your lots striped to maximize the capacity? Or, and this is something Chrissy can speak to, is there anything that you can do to use your lots differently? TNCs, which Chrissy can speak to, or even valet or any other amenities that you can do. And your curb management. So Chrissy, I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah, I think Sue raises a good point about curb management. And before the pandemic, we were focused on dealing with curb management at airports and the impact of transportation network companies, or TNCs, Uber and Lyft. We're focused on the planning, the analysis, the design of the curb, considering moving TNC pickup and drop off from the curb to the garage to eliminate some of that curb congestion. And we've worked with many airports on their TNC designs, whether that pickup and drop off is moved to a garage or a surface lot. Walker's completed a research study on TNC design and modeled various design layouts to optimize the throughput depending on the garage type and how much room we're dealing with. But given that there's not a lot of activity at the curb right now, it's a great time to look at all of your ground transportation data to review your curb management practices, compare your data to how much curb is allocated to the various shuttles, taxis, private vehicles, your deliveries, your TNCs, and then analyze that peak usage to look at the allocation, look at, is it adequate enough to avoid congestion at the curb, to avoid queuing, and then replan your curb based on that analysis. Do you need to reallocate your curb space? As Sue was talking about, your signage and wayfinding. Do you need to update that signage and wayfinding? Do you need to move your TNC pickup or TNC pickup and drop off to the garage to release some of that pressure at the curb so that when travel returns, you're prepared and you're in a better position. And as Sue was saying, it's just a good time to do this analysis and to make these changes now, because you don't have to deal with all the activity that normally occurs at the airport and at the curb.
Right, and that's one of the challenges that you have when you're planning a project, right, is how do you complete this project without affecting the passenger flow?
Exactly. And that's why it's the perfect time to look at this stuff. And I think another thing that airports are worried about is finances. The travel's so down, and
right.
Now's the perfect time for you to look at your operations. Where can you save money? If you have a parking operator that's running your parking or your valet services or your curb management or your ground transportation, whatever it may be, look at their contracts, see, talk to them, work with them, ask them, what can you do to help us cut expenses? What can you do to help us increase revenue? Really look at those areas to make sure that you are running as efficiently as possible.
And on that point, Sue, I think we always say airports should always be looking at their financial data, looking at those contracts, but now's a really good time to take a deep dive into your ground transportation data. With all the uncertainty, let's take a look at what we can control. And a financial analysis can help you get on solid footing as we begin to recover and improve. Ground transportation revenue, it's such a major piece of overall airport revenue. So analyzing your transportation data, your parking demand, those transactions, your revenue collection, how has parking performed over the past 5 years? How have TNCs affected parking revenue and other ground transportation revenues? So when Sue and I work at airports, so many times we go in and we hear this, the same thing, that TNCs haven't had an effect on our ground transportation revenues. And every time we look at the data, that's just not the case. When we perform a data analysis, we find that TNCs have usually had a negative effect on parking revenues. It's just been masked because employments have risen so dramatically over the past few years. But just given the current revenue loss, the loss of activity, it's really important now more than ever to understand your data and your finances to ensure your fee structures have not just historically been set to optimize revenue, giving the historical change in how people access the airport, but when you understand your data and it helps you just get a firm footing so that you can deal with the changes we're seeing now. You can deal with potential changes to all the different parking demand and ground transportation demand as travelers come back. Because when you're on that firm ground, you'll be better positioned to make those adjustments as necessary based on what we're seeing at how people change the way they want to access the airport. And, I think at the same time, it's thinking about data, it's a great time to look at your data practices because data is control. So you want to make sure that you're collecting the data you need. And are you relying on Uber and Lyft for data or the shuttles and taxis for data? Look at what agreements or practices need to be in place going forward so that you can continue to monitor what's happening on the ground as we emerge, which you might want to look at your data daily. So that you can ensure you're accommodating all these changes in demand and in ground transportation volumes. And then you can forecast any potential changes. We'll see, will people forgo TNCs and instead choose a rental car that sat empty for a few days? Will people choose to have someone drop them off at the airport instead of a TNC? So, and will parking demand go up in the short term and then begin to drop again as activity returns back to normal over the next year or two? So if you're actively collecting your data and analyzing it, you can react to those changes in real time.
And that's what I was going to ask you about, because of the pandemic, people are looking differently at TNCs, how they're going to use them, how they're going to use public transportation. And that's going to change the way people travel to and from airports. So it's been in a constant state of flux as the TNCs have come onto the scene, and then airports try to figure out how to manage that how to collect the fees, how to make it equitable across, between the taxi companies and the TNCs. And I think it seems like there's still a lot of airports that have not maybe committed to figuring out how to measure that data yet. Is that what you're finding as well?
Well, there's lots of variables that go into a TNC fee. We just completed an analysis that I'm not sure when this report will be released, but we were looking at measuring airport TNC fees compared to parking fees. And, if you look at just what an airport might be charging for pickup or drop off compared to that same traveler parking in a parking structure, there's a huge gap, up to, it could be $20, $25 a day that airport is losing that revenue. So, I think it's really thinking about the administrative, operational expenses that go into managing TNC pickup and drop off, that, all of the infrastructure investment that airports make when they move TNCs to a parking facility, when they move TNC pickup and drop off to a parking facility, and then, if they're moving to a parking facility, they're giving up that parking revenue. So, it's really important to, as I said, take that deep dive into your data so that you are adequately planning and have a fee structure so that you're not losing revenue, and that you're adequately covering your operational expenses. But as I think another important variable, though, is there's been so many state regulations around TNC fees and what airports can control and can't control because of those state regulations. Some states don't allow drop-off fees, for example, or some states don't allow fees at all. So, that really hamstrings the airport and what they can or can't charge. That's why the research and the data analysis is so important.
Yeah, and I think it varies too. I mean, we've seen some airports that are very much tracking literally everything regarding TNCs. Then we see other airports that are just now realizing that this is, the TNCs are having a huge effect on their revenue in other places, as Chrissy was discussing. It's cutting into their parking or their rental cars or whatever the case may be. So, I mean, I think we've worked with all different gamuts or ranges of, there's some airports just starting out, and then there's others that are, very far into tracking the data and figuring out how they want to run the TNCs.
Sue, talk a little bit more about what kind of advice you're giving your airports now in terms of getting ready for the traveling uptick.
Yeah, so I think I think some airports are starting to see some increases, and we've heard from a lot of airports that once they started seeing declines in their passenger volumes, that they did things like close the far out airports, the far out parking lots, whether that be for employees or economy lots. So they basically, what happened is they started moving their employees and their customers in and stopped running the shuttles, which was a great choice, because then that really cut down on what they needed to do as far as making it safe for their passengers. But now, as the traffic starts coming back, they need to have a plan. And, it's been my experience, once you get people into the closer, more convenient garages, it takes some time to get people moved out. So, have a plan in place of how you're going to do that. Is it when you hit a certain passenger load, or is it when you hit a certain percentage in your parking garages? Really think about and work with your operators if you have them, or with your internal parking staff. What is the plan to start moving people out, so that when passengers start coming back and want to park close in, where are you putting them? Think about how you're going to staff your parking garages. There have been a lot of parking folks, unfortunately, that have either been moved to other locations or have been furloughed. So do you have enough staff once the public starts coming back, that you can actually run your parking garages adequately? Think about your equipment. What can you, as I said before, what can you make contactless? how, if you're running valet operations, really think about how are you going to do that? How are you going to make it safe for your employees? How are you going to make it safe for the public? So, really have a plan in place. And it's been my experience that, airport parking operations are very complicated, as are ground transportation and TNC operations. So a lot of times there aren't these plans in place. A lot of times there isn't even the daily day-to-day procedures written. Everyone knows what they are, but not written. So, take the time to write things down, of what you're normally doing, and then also your plan to come when the airports come back. So, there's a lot of things that people should be doing right now to plan.
And that's a big question. I think as airports have to look so far out to figure out how to plan their terminals, how to plan their parking facilities, how are airports pivoting right now to adjust? Because we don't know what the new normal is, right? Nobody really knows.
Yeah, and I could talk a little bit about this, but I know Chrissy has this experience as well. Even now, even before COVID-19, the airports are planning, there's a lot of talk about autonomous vehicles and trying to plan, into the future for that as they're building parking garages. Can they take those garages and turn them into buildings, make sure that they're making those plans to do that ahead of time. So, like you said, they're always planning ahead so they do have that experience. I think for airports right now, I think the biggest thing is the financing for them, where there's many airports that are still moving ahead with projects that are going on, whether, that be ground transportation, parking related, or terminals, or whatever the case may be. There's some that are moving forward. There are some that have looked at their finances and said, we're going to put that on hold for right now. So, I think this is something that they're used to doing, but I think they really need to see what the industry is saying is going to happen to bring passengers back and plan that way. But I'll let Chrissy speak to that as well.
I think that we've seen over the past 10 or 15 years, so many different points where airports have had to deal with some sort of, major pandemic, or whether it's 9/11, deal with these big breaks in how travelers are both being willing to travel through the airlines, or how they access the airport. So, and then just in the same light, we've seen over the past 5 years just how TNCs have affected ground transportation and parking. So, I think airports, as Sue said, they're always planning for the future. Some airports we look with are really looking at hourly data, underground transportation data to see how things change hourly, daily, monthly. So, I think that airports, maybe even more than any other industry, have weathered many storms and can adequately use what has helped them in the past to plan for the future. But again, it's going back to making sure that your financial data is intact, that you're really looking at all the pieces that make up ground transportation and in your airline data, so that you can adequately plan as we see travel come back whenever, over the next year or two.
Really good advice. And nobody knows what's going to happen in the next year or two, but I know people are excited to get back out on the road and get back in planes and airports and get back to seeing the world and meeting up with people they love and people that they work with. So it's going to be interesting, and I think you offer some really good advice. I want to ask both Sue and Chrissy if you have any last advice or last thoughts that you want airports to consider on parking.
I'll throw out one. Right now, so Sue has worked in transportation demand management for a long time, and we do a lot of transportation demand management at Walker. But right now, transportation demand management, which is offering incentives so that people choose not to drive alone and park, is more about managing parking demand, because or likely in the near term to see an uptick in parking. But we're also seeing increases in biking. So, having adequate biking facilities for workers who may choose to bike. And, I don't want to forget that while transit ridership may be down right now, especially transit ridership to airports, there's still people and there's still workers who rely on transit to get to work. They have no other option. So ensuring that you have reliable transit service, that it continues, or doing things like offering guaranteed rides home for your workers who rely on transit, that's going to be important as well, so that they feel that, they can get to work on time and they won't be stranded at an airport because, they have no other way to get there besides transit.
That's important. Sue?
Yeah, so I would say, again, use this time to do all of these things you can't normally do. Document things, look at your systems, everything that Chrissy and I have talked about. And I'm so glad that Chrissy mentioned that. I was also going to say that, is I think a lot of people are saying, oh, well, people won't ride transit. But, there's always going to be a group of people that's what they rely on. So don't forget about that. And, do things like the bike facilities, as Chrissy was talking about. Are there any other incentives that you can give your employees that do rely on some alternate form of transportation to work?
Great points. Excellent. Sue, Chrissy, thank you so much for spending time with me today. Walker Consultants, I will put their website up here at the last slide, and I will see you all soon. Thanks for joining us.